works real hard. There were days when you tried, there were days when you start trying to please the crowd when they're unforgiving. There are easier ways to make a living. Well, we've come a long way since the start of things, when we've seen the joy that hard work brings. You've made us cry and you've made us smile. You've hit the front, now it's all worthwhile.
The 2023 Grand Final approaches. It is Brisbane versus Collingwood. 20 years since Brisbane completed their famous three-peat of flags against Collingwood. These two clubs are now destined to meet one another once again. These two clubs may not be the biggest rivals in the competition, and one could say they aren't even Collingwood's biggest interstate rivals. But Brisbane and Collingwood have had a long history between each other, that stems back to Fitzroy and Bears of old. Carlton and Collingwood are today's the league's largest and oldest rivalry, but in the very early days of the VFL, Collingwood's first rival wasn't the Blues, but the Maroons. Fitzroy and Collingwood were both inaugural members to the VFL and were destined to be rivals due to geographical proximity. The Maroons as they were and the Magpies were neighbours. But it was Fitzroy who was first founded in 1883, and with the Collingwood and Fitzroy municipalities lying adjacent to one another, the local rivalry between them was intense. Fitzroy had a senior club, Collingwood residents reasoned why not Collingwood. Football was already being played in Collingwood, with the strongest of the Collingwood clubs being Britannia, which had a strong link with Fitzroy. However, despite this, Britannia was strongly involved in the Collingwood application, and in 1892 Collingwood was founded. Britannia disbanded. Many of its members and players conferred their allegiance to the new club, although some were disgruntled by this move and instead transferred to Fitzroy. This is where the early Fitzroy-Collingwood rivalry begins. In 1897, both teams were inaugural members into the VFL, and although it may seem hard to believe today, considering the ultimate destiny of the two clubs, Fitzroy was the league's original superpower. They dominated the league in the very early days of the competition. By 1922, Fitzroy was the most successful club in the competition with 7 premierships, which they held until Collingwood surpassed that record in 1929. For Collingwood's first 15 years of existence, Fitzroy was the only foe that mattered. Newspaper descriptions of Collingwood-Fitzroy matches from 1892 to 1906 commonly emphasized the unduly rough play and heated suburban rivalry between the clubs. This football century said the bitterness between the pair was more prevalent among supporters than footballers, with the Maroons players frequently pelted with bitumen after games at Victoria Park. In their first encounter in the 1897, it was Collingwood who secured the bragging rights, but the Maroons would win the first grand final the following year in 1898, and then became the first team to win back-to-back in 1899. It would be in the 1898 final series where they met for the first time, which Fitzroy won by 11 points at Brunswick Street Oval in the semi-final. In the sectional rounds of 1902, Fitzroy and Collingwood played against each other in the second round, which the Pies dominated on their way to their first premiership. The next year, the Maroons and Pies met in the grand final. It was a tight affair for most of the match, but wayward kicking for Fitzroy would prove costly, with 3-11-29 to 4-7-31 being the final score. Fitzroy had the chance to win it with Gerald Brosnan having a set shot for the goal off the last kick of the game, but missed narrowly to give Collingwood back-to-back flags. But Fitzroy would have their revenge 2 years later when it was their turn for back-to-back flags once again, in what was the coldest September Melbourne has ever had since records began in 1855. The conditions at the MCG were damp, heavy, and soft all through. With a bitter cold, the match's conditions weren't there for spectacle. However, the atmosphere in the crowd was bitter. The Herald portrayed a carnival atmosphere surrounding the game, suggesting the two clubs had a friendly rivalry. But the Maroons and Magpies were anything but friendly. With no goals scored in the first quarter and only a solitary point in the last, it was the premiership quarter, the third, where Fitzroy showed their status with superior pace and power, kicking 3 goals with a wind. No goals were scored in the first quarter, and only 1 behind in the last. And this would give Fitzroy a comfortable winning margin, while Collingwood would have the misfortune of scoring the lowest score in the season in 1905 in the grand final, a feat only matched in the 1927 and 1960 grand finals. After becoming the only team to win the premiership and the wooden spoon in the one season in 1916. Due to the heavily restricted number of teams playing as a result of the First World War, Fitzroy would find themselves in the right place at the right time, beating Collingwood in the semi-final by 6 points before beating Carlton twice in the prelim and the grand final for that 1916 premiership. In 1917, there were slightly more teams, 6, and Fitzroy were back in 1917 for another grand final appearance, although, again, with a negative win-loss record, finishing 4th of the 6 teams that they were competing. The Maroons would face Collingwood in the preliminary final the week before to qualify for the grand final, a close game that the Maroons won by a goal. But come grand final day, the fortunes were reversed. Fitzroy went down by 35 points, with Dick Lee starring with 4 goals in Alec Much's 100th game for the club. Collingwood built a lead in the first quarter, but the margin could have been much higher, with Pies kicking 9 goals 20 to Fitzroy's 5 goals in what was Collingwood's 4th premiership. Fitzroy was well ahead of the Packs in the early days. In its 7th premiership in 1922, again, they had to face Collingwood on the way to the grand final. They defeated the Pies in a thrilling semi-final by 4 points. In 1922, they met Collingwood 4 times in 4 rough matches, each time for Fitzroy. But Collingwood were about to leave the Maroons behind in the dust, as the Pies went on to form arguably the greatest ever dynasty, with 4 flags in a row from 1927 to 1930, with the 1929 grand final being the one that finally overtook the Maroons to be the league's most successful club. And the 30s continued to be a powerful one for the Collingwood machine. With Fitzroy, they struggled, with Hayden Bunton being a breath of shining light in the 30s. For a team that won 7 in 26 years, it would be 22 before they tasted another one. And that would be in 1944, but for Fitzroy, by this time, the rivalry with Collingwood was dead. For Collingwood, Fitzroy, their first rival, was now an afterthought. Carlton, Richmond, Melbourne and Essendon had all eclipsed Fitzroy and more in the following decade. But for Fitzroy, they never forgot their hatred for Collingwood. And in the 80s, Fitzroy began to re-emerge. With Robert Walls lured to the Lions, the team under Walls showed its most significant success, making finals 4 times. One of those was against Collingwood, who they met in a thriller in the 1981 semi-final. It was a heated clash where former Fitzroy stars Graham Allen and Warwick Irwin, now Magpies. Collingwood got the hot start, leading by 38 points by half-time. However, the Roys roared back to life in the second half, led by impressive performances from veteran stars David McMahon, Matt Rendell, and stars such as Gary Wilson and Chris Smith. The Lions kicked 6 goals in the third quarter to be within 14 points by the final change. They continued this form deep into the 4th quarter and seemed set for a famous victory. However, Peter Dacos had other ideas, slotting a goal, reducing the margin to 4. And then Ross Brewer, now Collingwood led by 2 all of a sudden. A frantic few minutes of play would eventuate. Fitzroy would score a point. The Magpies were through to the preliminary final, winning by a point. The Lions were successful, but not great in the 80s under Walls and Parkins, with the finals culminating in a prelim in 1986. They had solid crew of players such as Bernie Quinlan, Ron Alexander, Gary Wilson, Gary Purd, and Paul Roos. They were a solid team, but not a rich one. They were in heavy deep, as were many clubs in the league. At the end of 1986, Fitzroy were given a choice to move to Brisbane, but ultimately Leon Weingard voted to remain in Melbourne, and so Brisbane Bears were born.
What do we say when we run out to play? Dare to beat the bear. What do we say when we run our way? Dare to beat the bear. We're hot, we're mean, we're strong, we're a team. We're the very best team you've ever seen. We're the Brisbane Bears.
The Bears had a very short history, lasting only 10 years, and did not form any rivals in that time. The closest they came to was quite possibly Collingwood itself. One of the Bears' first signings was Collingwood's Mark Williams. The Pies and the Bears would first meet in round 6 at Victoria Park in 1987. Collingwood won easily under their coach Lee Matthews. The most notable occurrence between Collingwood and the Bears, though, that was Nathan Buckley. Already a star in the SANFL, Buckley was a Magarey medal winner. But Buckley didn't want to go to Brisbane. The coach of the time, Robert Walls, insisted that the Bears don't bend to the will of a powerful Victorian club in recruitment matters. And so Buckley had to go to the Bears. And he starred in his first year, winning the inaugural Rising Star. But Buckley desired to win a premiership, and so he left the Bears at the end of '93, traded to Collingwood, where he became Collingwood's most favourite son since Bob Rose. For Buckley, though, it would prove ironic. In 1996, Fitzroy, in deep debt to the island of Nauru, yes, Nauru, entered administration due to financial pressures. Ironically, 6 years earlier, Fitzroy had turned down a merger with the Bears in 1990. But in 96, they now had no choice. Initially, a merger with North Melbourne looked most likely to form. The North Fitzroy Kangaroos, however, failed to win the support of the other AFL clubs, and at the 11th hour, Fitzroy and the Bears were to merge. The Brisbane Lions were born. The Lions found success in 97, but collapsed to the bottom of the ladder in 98. The merge was looking like a failure, but an SOS was sent out to former Collingwood coach, the man who had broken Collingwood's grand final streak of heartbreaks in October 1990, Lee Matthews. The man was now to coach Brisbane. Could he do the impossible and make Brisbane successful? For Collingwood, well, they were struggling in the second half of the 90s, failing to adapt to the changes that had occurred, as would many powerful Victorian clubs. Equalisation wasn't a friend. The Pies were the wooden spooners of 99, and for Buckley, a premiership looked forever away. 1999 is perhaps Collingwood's worst ever year, with the team farewelling their home ground of 100 years at Victoria Park in the final match of the season. And it was not a fond farewell. They faced Brisbane, and they lost by 42 points. The fortress, for 100 years, was now a whipping boy. But 99 was to mark an important milestone for the club. New president Eddie Maguire took over. Maguire had a very modern way of thinking about the game, and unlike the other big Victorian clubs in Carlton, Richmond, Essendon, and Hawthorn to a lesser extent, was able to turn Collingwood around, adapting to the modern system of drafting, recruitment, and development, and so the Collingwood era of struggle with the modern system was to be brief. And at the end of 99, well, Eddie lured Mick from West Coast to Collingwood, and together they turned the Pies around. It was the 2000s, when Collingwood and Brisbane were at their most ferocious, with the name's biggest coaches and players defining it. And in 2002, well, this is when things really heated up. They would meet in a classic match under the roof of the Docklands. Ross and Buckley both starred, collecting 31 and 29 disposals for their respective sides, while future Collingwood coach Craig McRae kicked 3 goals for Brisbane in a thrilling match. The Pies would upset the reigning premiers in only their second loss for the year by 3 points, and then they met in a grand final. Brisbane were overwhelmingly red-hot favourites for the 2002 grand final. Very few gave Collingwood a chance. The conditions were wet and slippery. For older Pies supporters, the weather may have been a good omen. Memories of one of the game's greatest upsets in the 1958 grand final. And that was what Collingwood were looking likely at one stage. Keeping Brisbane goalless in the first quarter for the first time in 253 matches, Collingwood had the first goal by Anthony Rocker. And it would be 5 minutes into the second quarter until Brisbane would finally kick their first goal. The 0-2 grand final was a tough contested battle with few goals kicked, slippery conditions making it hard, and the two sides were very evenly battled throughout the game. Collingwood were led by their courageous skipper Nathan Buckley, who were looking like they could pull off one of the game's greatest upsets. However, Brisbane's equally courageous Michael Voss would put in a true captain's performance, putting a memorable goal and playing sensationally in the final term. However, it was Jason Ackermanis, who had been having a very poor day, who would be Brisbane's hero, following instructions from Lee to play in front of Lynch, and from a contest, while the ball fell forward for Acker, he gathered and with his left foot stamped the sealer. Brisbane were premiers in the closest grand final since 1989. There would be controversy with the Norm Smith medal, with Collingwood's Nathan Buckley awarded the Norm Smith medal as the best player afield. However, the panelists were asked to lodge their votes during the later part of the final quarter, with some doing so as early as halfway through the quarter. 3 of the 5 panelists famously claimed in the days after the match that they would have awarded more votes to Voss had they voted after the siren. The next year, Brisbane and Collingwood would meet again in the final series. The two sides had met twice during the home and away season, with 1 win each. But Brisbane were now seen as the lesser of the two sides. With injuries and an aging playing list, people were writing the Lions off, especially after the qualifying final, a game which Collingwood won by 15 points, meaning Brisbane had to go the hard way. For Collingwood, they were favourites come grand final day, but had one blemish in Anthony Rocker's suspension. The Brisbane had numerous injury clouds, including captain Michael Voss with an injured knee, Nigel Lappin with broken ribs, and both Alistair Lynch and Martin Pike with hamstring tightness. But all 4 ended up playing well, with Nigel Lappin playing very well with a punctured lung. For Brisbane, it needed its other stars to step up, And did they ever? Simon Black, the Brownlow medalist of 02, would be the Norm Smith medalist of 03, playing his greatest ever game, and to this day having the most disposals in the grand final, only tied with Christian Petrarca, with 39 disposals and a goal, while Jason Ackermanis stepped up with 5 goals, and Lynch scored 4. Brisbane dominated the game from the get-go, although it started dramatically when Jonathan Brown was knocked to the ground by Scott Burns in an incident that invoked Dermot Brereton in the opening minutes of the game. But Brisbane took the early lead and never gave up, becoming the first club since Melbourne in the 50s to win 3 in a row. For Buckley, the 2003 Brownlow medalist and 02 Norm Smith medalist, while he lacked the one medal he really wanted. Ironically, he could have had 3 of them. In 04, Brisbane would make their 4th consecutive grand final and had a chance of equaling Collingwood's record of 4 that year, but will go down to the other Magpies in Port Adelaide. Now, 20 years after Brisbane's last premiership, they face Collingwood once again. In recent times, Brisbane hold the streak with 6 consecutive wins against the Pies, including 2 matches this year in round 4 of the Gabba, which was Collingwood's first loss for the season, and again in round 23 of the Docklands, winning by 24 points in a game that is most remembered by Devon Robertson being shirtless. It's the first time since 2014 that the top 2 sides will face one another, and it's Chris Fagan's Lions versus the champion from those Lions premierships who broke Collingwood's hearts all those years ago in Craig McRae. How will history play out? Well, time will tell. Thank you guys, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more.